So the third thing I wanted to talk about, again, relative to how do we unlock this data, how do we sort of make this, is something that I see a lot in the data space and the tech space in general, is this idea of how do we build partnerships across business and tech teams, right? This is nothing new. But I think part of it is that there is an inherent tension when you're thinking about upgrading technology. And one of the ways this came real for me was up until very recently, this was my car, actually my car. I have PR people that help me with my decks, and they tried to like switch it on. I'm like, no, I want the picture of my car that I took on my phone. So this was my 2006 Toyota Corolla. It actually was my first car. When I came to Carlson, we were living in DC, so we had no car. My first car probably since high school, I guess, my first grown-up car. And really, there was sort of this debate going on in my household. And so, why should I keep this car? Right? It's low cost. We already paid for it. It was like $0 monthly cost for the car. That was awesome. It's still getting the job done, right? I could get from A to B. I could get in the car and get here. I could go wherever. It's comfortable and familiar. I knew how it worked. I knew what to do. I liked how it felt. There might be some quirks, right? But I knew how to handle those, right? Whether it's this thing doesn't work or the seatbelt doesn't fasten the right way, whatever. But I, as the operator, knew what was going on. There are all these new features, but that's just gimmicks, right? I didn't need that. I had what I needed, again, getting the job done. And the last thing that I mentioned, it was already paid for. It was free, right? And so then the other side of the debate, it wasn't the safest in Minneapolis winters. That might have been legitimate. It was hard to squeeze all three of my children, growing children, in that back seat. And now only one's in a booster, but even, not the biggest car back there. So it wasn't always functional for my family. A new car would be more comfortable. Heated seats, more space, satellite radio, all these great things. And even outside of the comfort, there are some safety features in the new technology that are legitimate, right? It's going to keep me safer. It's going to keep my kids safer. Blind spot detection, a rear camera, all these things that didn't exist in 2006. Maybe there's a little bit of social prestige that this was an old car and whatever it is. And so this debate was actually largely one between myself and my wife. And whatever, we both saw both sides. But as we were having this debate, what I realized is that this was also sort of this traditional debate that goes on with technology, right? I started thinking about, how do I feel about this car? And then I heard someone saying, you know what? This is old technology, but we've already invested in it, and we know all the right ways to sort of Band-Aid it and patch it up, and it's still getting the job done, and there's no cost to it right now. And, I know you've heard about this new fill-in-the-blank IT technology, but that's just bells and whistles. We can still get it done. And then the other side, whether it's the business or someone else, it's, okay, well, there's a legitimate need. There are these new features that are going to help you. It's going to make our life easier. Technology is going to be that way. And I think that we sort of always have this sort of constant tug-of-war. And it's probably not fair to say business and tech, they can be swapped. They can be in different places. And depending on the organization, right, there might also be this new sort of data analytics too. So like at Target, we were just talking a little bit about it, that EDABI team sits under the COO, which is separate than the CIO. And right, so you have these different perspectives. So there might be a different perspective around data, the business perspective, the tech perspective. And then that can get hard. It is like a tug of war. And I think in the end, what I believe is that, and in the debate with my wife as well about the car, everyone's a little right and everyone's a little wrong, right? And so, but we know we have to work together to try to get through these. And so how do we do that? And what I would say, my hypothesis around is that there's three things we can work on together, some of which I've mentioned and alluded to. One is empathy. The second is intellectual humility. And the third is transparency. And so I want to explore these three topics a little bit relative to the data space, relative to the tech space, and see some of the ways that we could sort of build this up together. Oops. You could probably tell some of these I had more help with the fancy animation from our PR department as well. So what is empathy? It's the ability to understand and to share the feelings of another. And I think, and I've touched on some of these, I think there's some common pitfalls around empathy that cause more of this tension that we see between tech and business and data. One is minimizing others' concerns and priorities, right? And that's just sort of the core idea of empathy of, not even acknowledging that it might be legitimate, right? So I talked about like the case of limiting something so that it doesn't become, so systems don't crash on Monday. If you have no ability to understand that the engineer responsible for a system staying up has a concern, about the uptime, and vice versa, they don't have an understanding of like the needs you have for data in the business, then you sort of end up with this impasse. I think related, it's also like failing to see the pressures on other teams, right? So everyone has pressures. People have pressures from their boss. People have pressures from upstream dependencies, constraints that are put on them by others. And so when we don't acknowledge those, when we don't talk about those, or at least acknowledge that there's something that we all can't control, or maybe be a pay grade above us, then we don't think about that. Another thing is just having a static view of the current environment. So we're always going to do it the same way as we did before, right? I have this car. I like this car. I don't even want to talk about what's different because I don't even want to acknowledge that's there. And then I think the last one is just there's also this often a minimal understanding of the business or technical context, right? And so, I might not be the technical person. Some of this even goes into specialization, but if I have no idea of some of the technical constraints, as the business person, how can I really empathize with you? And vice versa, if as a technical practitioner, an engineer, a data scientist, an analyst, if I have no idea of what it means to run a business or to run that part of the business or the pressures that are on you, how can I ever really partner with you and figure that out? And so we will unpack a few different ways to think about it. I'm going to share a few stories, hopefully none that anyone at Target gets mad about. I don't think they would. But I wanted to just take a minute and think a little bit about a situation where you've either shown empathy or have been shown empathy by someone else. It could be work, it could be home. And then conversely, think about an example of when you either have been unempathetic, right, good self-awareness, or when someone was unempathetic to your needs, and we'll share in a minute. Does anyone have a story of when they've been empathetic or had empathy shown to them? Go ahead. I was going to say, no hope. There's no empathy out there.
So part of this program is a lot of group work, which is always challenging. But our team is, actually a lot of the groups I've been part of, but especially this one is, we're across large areas, and so getting together is not always easy. But we work together to meet online or in person as much as possible, or various things happen. So some of us have kids, and working through those situations, or other challenges have come up. So as a group, we've been able to try to work around those things and make sure that we still accomplish the end goal.
So the flexibility of everyone else around you is the empathy, shows the empathy that you have other things going on, right? Not just in work, but or school, but in life. Other examples of empathy? It would be really sad if we have a lot of examples of unempathetic and no empathy. Go ahead.
There's a child that the daycare I bring my kid to, and he's always fussing and crying, and some people kind of complain about it, oh, he's always whining. But when I first saw him, I had empathy for him. I'm oh, he's clearly in pain, not deep pain, but he's clearly something wrong. He's tired, he's hungry. So instead of being annoyed, I kind of felt empathetic for him.
Yeah. No, I mean, sometimes it's the two sides. You could be annoyed or you could be empathetic and try to help someone through it. Any other empathy stories? What about times when someone has not been empathetic to you? At work, at school, in life? What does that feel like? What do people have an example of when it felt like you were no empathy for you and your needs?
Well, driving on the road is a lot.
Yes. That might be me. According to my wife, that might be me. Now I have a fancy new car that lets me even honk louder, probably, right? No, that's true. On the road, that's a good example. I think certainly, look, there's a natural tension to things in life and data and tech. I felt like maybe early on as we were doing stuff with real-time data and getting insights to people in more real time and using the phone, there maybe was a lack of empathy of like either it's like, oh, well, that's not that important, or you don't really need that, or whatever it is, but then starting to see the real business impact, and some of it's just being open to thinking about those things. So I have a few more examples. Any other examples people want to share before I move on?
When your boss thinks like it's a 1 hour job and it takes you a couple of days to do that.
Yes.
That type of problem.
No, that's an interesting, like, special case of empathy too. Of especially if you start dealing with executives or people at a higher level, like to them, things just show up, right? Because they're the boss, and people say, "Hey, I need this awesome report," and it just happens. They don't care that someone worked all weekend or copy and paste in Excel or whatever it is. But if sometimes it's truly unempathetic, or sometimes we're hiding the facts from them, so then they can't be empathetic about what it is. But yeah, that can be hard. I often try, especially when I'm talking with our product teams at Domo, it's like, I feel like there's the royal just, right? Well, I just want you to add that field, or I just want you to fix this feature. And that's hard because you don't always know all the different implications, right? And so some of that's trust over time. So one of the examples, and this was under an old tech leadership at Target, an old regime. They used to have this meeting called the city council meeting, which was sort of this technical review. The idea being like you sort of permit things like a city council permit. And again, back with those things that sort of burn into your memory, we had been developing this was when I was in digital, we've been developing some cube technology that people really loved and they were really excited about. And we had budget to like expand some of the infrastructure for it. And we went to this big fancy meeting and they'd approved it. But I still remember there was a note in the official meeting minutes that said, but this is not an endorsement of rushing something from POC to production too quickly. And I still remember it because it felt like it was false empathy to me. Like it was like, yeah, we're going to approve this, but you guys were stupid for doing this. But it felt for me a little bit like, how dare you create something the business actually loves and wants to use and is excited about? And the president of Target.com was pissed because this was it was almost like being chastising us for doing this. Now, good. Look, there are reasons to be responsible about it, but I think you have to be genuine in your empathy and how you do that. Go ahead.
Do you think that's genuine? Do you think they're genuinely trying to chastise the team, or is it more management trying to cover their butts in case the POC is inadequately tested and ends up blowing something up?
I think it's valid. I don't think it was knowing that it's a good pushback on me even, right? Like, I think it was less about the stability. We also weren't talking about something like terribly complicated. We're talking about like SQL cubes. So there really wasn't much risk. I think it was more that my reading of it, and again, like mine, was it was more about chastising for not going through their official channels or using the tools they thought were right for unlocking the business. But maybe I was unempathetic to their perspective as well, and so it's a good pushback. There's always two sides to the story. I think another piece of empathy, and this comes up again with this idea of like we brought all these teams together to form this EDABI, data analytics COE at Target. And I think that there is sort of this centralization dilemma that leads to some potential empathy issues, right? So, and often you find this with IT, with data, there's this want to centralize, right? Because there's a lot of good and benefits from that, right? So if you can improve reliability and consistency by keeping things more centralized, if you can reduce duplication and expense, right? I mean, Target had lots of little small analytics teams that were negotiating separate contracts sometimes with Tableau or Domo or whoever, and it wasn't necessarily all aligned. Can you align on common tools and principles that make sense and do that? And can you up your game on technical and analytical skill set, right? So that is a little bit of that specialization, but like there's a lot of goodness that comes from that. But I think what I found when I've looked at this empathy lens, and then again, back to my prioritization, you can focus on what's more important. But I do think that centralization can also create an empathy gap between these groups that we're just talking about, right? Between IT or data or tech functions and the business functions. And so some of the struggle is, how do we find ways to overcome that gap and to jump that gap together? And so there's lots of different approaches, and none of them are necessarily right or wrong, but some things that we've tried and some that I touched on at Target. One is, right, even if you're centralized, where do you sit? Right, and that's a hard argument sometimes, because if you have teams that are not co-located, it's hard to argue that there's value in co-location if you're not yourself co-located. But if you happen to be in the same place, like if we're all in Minneapolis, can I go sit there? Or once a week, can I sit there for a day and actually hear just the cadence and the buzz and what's going on in a group? Do I more formally embed analysts, especially if I have product teams? So this is something at Target, as Target evolved to having more of a product culture and building more of its own infrastructure for the website, for the app, for POS, for all those different things, could I, even though I maybe from an HR perspective have a centralized team, can I say, you might report to this person who knows all about analytics, but you actually sit day to day in this other product team and are being part of that team and doing that. I mentioned before the idea of this urgent care, which was another way to think about it. And then also this idea of just the small agile teams, right? So, I might have centralized expertise, but independent of HR, independent of this centralization, can I still find ways to create small teams that bring together an engineer, an analyst, a business person, and without that HR sort of constraint, still create that. So I just think it's important for us to think about that as you sort of look at centralization. And sometimes these things swing back and forth, right? So you centralize everything, and then you're like, oh, we're going to break it all up. And then you're like, wait, this is a mess, because it's all broken up. And so it's really about how do you find those ways to maintain the balance between the two pieces. I think another thing around empathy for me is this idea of spending a day in someone else's shoes, right? How do I understand how technology is used day to day? So if I'm at Target, does it mean working in a checkout lane? If I'm, in the business at Target, does that mean sitting with an engineer and seeing the kinds of pressures and how do they deal with downtime or issues that come up or all those other things? And so it's not a complicated thing, but I think it's a good reminder to always do that and to value that piece of it, because then you can sort of approach someone in a different way, right? If I'm building a system for you and I know your day-to-day or the pressures, or I see you on the phone with your boss and your boss is yelling at you and all these other things, it doesn't mean every day I'm going to be doing that, but it gives me a new window into how you work and what it does, and I think that's important when we're doing technical solutions to understand that. Other things that I've seen work, I think there's something really powerful about standing up for other people. If you see your peers or even your superior or your employees are in the wrong, it can get tricky, right? You have to build relationships and other things like that. But, if something's not right, if you've made a bad decision, if a peer of yours has made a bad decision, someone who works for you has made a bad decision, if you let that go, that sends a really powerful, unempathetic message. If you are willing sometimes, it doesn't mean every decision is wrong. It doesn't mean sometimes there's not two sides to an issue, but I've just found like the times when I've been able to do that help. Similarly, like how do I publicly acknowledge when partners have a valid concern, right? So, and the publicly is big, because again, we're talking about emotions, we're talking about empathy. If I say, you know what, I hadn't thought about that uptime concern, let's go back and test this together. Or, you know what, I've been pushing too hard for real-time data, let's take a step back so we can make sure this system's stable before we do that. And it doesn't mean all the time, but I think that can be very powerful. I think over-communication and explanation is really key, especially in the world we live in now. And I think over time, I used to be very, not shy about communicating. I'm not a quiet person by nature, but, should we send another email? Or I don't want to bug people, or like, should we do email and a hip chat, or a Slack now at Target? Or what is it? And the reality is we're all so busy. We're all so inundated with stuff. Yes, you don't want to spam someone, but you have to realize that you might think this is the most important thing in the world, and you're crafting this email or you're crafting this message. People just need to be reinforced, and if it's important, you need to reinforce it in multiple channels. And it's the kind of thing where I started sending out, when we started doing some of these open labs for buyers, I would sort of send out these emails sometimes, like teaser emails, saying like, hey, here's some things we're working on. You guys should stop by the open lab or the urgent care to talk about these things. And what I found out too was like, even if only a few people came in that day, I'd then run into a friend and be like, oh, I really liked your email, right? So people are listening, people are there. You have to know that like everyone is busy, and just because they don't show up with what you want or they don't respond to the email, having that communication can be a really big piece of it. People care about money, right? So understanding what people's financial incentives can be really important to being empathetic, right? Because at the end of the day, if someone is incented on uptime and you're trying to do something that's going to put uptime at risk, you have to understand that like inherently they might not have a lot of tolerance for that. And obviously changing that is a whole nother conversation in the HR conversation, all those things. But not understanding that really risks like creating more of that empathy gap. And then the last thing, similar to what we talked about, is just avoiding the I don'ts, right? Like I don't deal with that. I don't care about that. I'm not the specialist in this. So, that creates, that I don't statement creates a us and them mentality, which is starting to build up that unempathetic wall. So empathy was number one. Number two is this idea of intellectual humility, which also was talked a lot in that HBR article I mentioned. And so what is intellectual humility? Whoops. Miss this slide? Oh, here. And really, so it's right. It's about a willingness to consider views other than your own. It's understanding that our personal knowledge is finite. It's an understanding that the world is changing and that the future will diverge from the present. And it's curiosity to learn what is new and explore other options, right? And so if we think about the flip side of intellectual hubris, I only value my own views. I overestimate the value of what I already know. I constantly use the past to justify the future. I have a limited desire to learn what is new and what's there. And so I think coming to these conversations, and again, this is an outcrop of empathy, with this attitude of intellectual humility can be a really important tool in how we start breaking down these barriers and working together. So one piece of that humility is valuing diversity. Obviously, this is always a hot topic. Everyone's for diversity, all those things. But I think there's lots of diversity, right? There's diversity of thought, diversity of skills, diversity of style, diversity of experience. And if you come in with this hubris, if you come in with an intellectual hubris that I'm the only one who knows, you're going to lose the benefits of some of these. And so I think one of the really important things with diversity and with this humility is understanding your own diversity, right? So, know what kind of people complement your own diversity, right? So I like, right, I sort of mentioned, I didn't like the finance that was about everything planned and on a schedule. I like, ambiguity. I like trying new problems. So then that means, like, for me, I am very well complemented by someone who is good at process and schedule and staying on deadline and organizing things. And I have to know that about myself. I have to push myself to work and think differently sometimes, right? I think if I think of the arc of my career, as I was managing more people, as I had larger teams, I have to sort of subsume some of that. I have to say, well, I know I like this ambiguity, but there's certain things that I need to do for a team to be clear on my communication. Or I might be, for a long time, I didn't love documentation or wikis or things like that, but then I realized that's part of scaling your impact is being able to communicate effectively. I think a big thing for me around this diversity and sort of this humility is this idea that self-awareness is not enough, right? So you still might be driving people crazy, right? So for a long time, my attitude was like I like ambiguity, I like to do these things, I like to work last minute. I sort of had this attitude of like, I'm very self-aware of that. I will tell you that I like to do things last minute. And you know what? Once you get to know me and you've worked with me, you know what? You should just handle it because you've seen me go last minute 5 times. I always deliver, no problem, right? And so then one day I was doing one of these leadership exercises where you do Myers-Briggs or something, and they do the thing where like they have you stand at 2 ends of the room, depending on which answer you gave for a question. And I was talking about this. I'm like, yeah, I do. I like. Would you do something if you had assignment in 2 weeks, would you do it 2 weeks in advance or the night before? And I'm standing over there, I'm like, but I'm self-aware, like you should know every way. And finally someone on the other end actually screamed at me. Like, you're driving me nuts. Like, you people drive me nuts. I don't care how many times you do it. You are driving me nuts. And so it doesn't mean that I'm going to change. It doesn't mean I'm going to be fully 2 weeks. But that was sort of this flip for me of, you know what, it's not just about proving myself. It's not just about self-awareness. It's about understanding how that all fits into everything. And how can I mitigate some of that, whether it's doing a little bit of it early or doing the pieces that they were dependent upon it early, or just knowing when it was worth pushing to the end or when I should move things up. And so I think that's a big part of humility and diversity, is to understand that it's more than just self-awareness on your impact. The other piece of humility that I think is important is this idea of the toolbox, right? And we talked a little bit about this and some other things, right? So you sort of have the classic one, a hammer, nail. Everything's a nail if you have a hammer. The one I actually like better is this idea of if I'm trying to hammer a nail with a saw, right? So I turn it the other way and I'm trying to do this. And, there's some others, but the reason I like it is because maybe I like bloody hands, but you can sort of see the natural progression, right? If I'm hammering a nail with a saw, and I'm trying to be empathetic, right? I'm doing the things we talked about. I'm trying to build things. You might say, man, your hands are bloody. Let's focus on is the whole idea of symptoms. Let's focus on getting you better bandages, or getting a pad for the saw, or you can do all this work to try to address this problem, but really you just need to use a hammer, right? And so, so I think that's some of the risk, and again, having this sort of toolbox mentality, and a little bit has to do with humility, right? Like my one tool isn't the only tool out there, but it is a risk of like you just focus on the empathy, you might miss some of that broader picture of like, I'm not actually solving the right problem, even though I'm sitting there saying, I'm so empathetic, I'm awesome. I hear this guy has bloody hands and I'm going to fix it. It's just not there. And so some of the things in terms of having a toolbox mentality, right, is sort of that idea of how do I interchange tools and adjust to that need. A lot of this is similar to this idea of end to almost end, right? I'm building the tools, I'm building the platforms to empower people, not solving the specific problem. The power in being able to switch, right? When I would interview people, I really looked for that curiosity and that ability to switch between new things, right? Because the one thing we know, like, there will always be a new programming language, there will be new technology, there will be new fill in the blank. And so if I'm only good at learning one thing and doing one thing, and using that hammer or using that saw, it gets harder and harder for me to at least illustrate to me as an interviewer, let's say, that I can deal with that new, versus someone might not have exactly the skill set I need, but they've shown, well, I use this technology to solve this problem, and then I had to learn a new technology to solve this problem. That to me is over time where the big differentiator is for companies even. I think another one is sort of the end user, or like if we think about the person using the data or whatever, they shouldn't care if I'm using new technology or new tools. They shouldn't care that I have a power saw now, or I have an electric screwdriver or whatever it is. They should still just be getting the product and what they need. And it's back to this mindset, right? It's thinking differently about things and not just doing that. And I think back to this idea of end to end. A lot of times, that's what we do. We'd say, there's a problem, there's a tool, we're going to build it, as opposed to building a toolbox and the skill set that we need to use a toolbox. So the last piece, and we talked a little bit earlier about transparency too, but I think that being able to, skip that, build transparency is the last piece of some of this relationship between technology and whatever. And it's hard because, again, like the business or whoever, fill in the blank, isn't an engineer. They don't know what they're actually building. They don't know what it takes to actually build this stuff out. But some of the issues that I see out there, so you have the black box syndrome, right? So no one likes a black box, right? I gave the example of the algorithm at the TV network is a piece of that, right? How do you start explaining what you can? And I sort of think there's the just trust us syndrome, right? Like no one, like that doesn't work. You need to figure out how to be more transparent. And it's also this, people start feeling like they're not smart enough to have it explained, right? So you have to find ways to to share more of what you're doing and to explain what you can, right? So I think share the detail you can, explain what you can, empower users to plug and play, like in the TV network example I mentioned. Communicate why something may be too complex, right? So if you just say, hey, you're never going to understand this, versus, hey, here's some of the complexity behind this. I wanted to make sure you understood. We don't really have time to go through the whole thing, but again, it's the transparency to that. And then I think when you can, show your work. And so one of the examples I use around this was, and this is not real data, but this was something that happened a few years ago when we started having more of this real-time data available on Thanksgiving, where we had sort of this by-hour view, and it had all this logic built in behind it, because you have stores across multiple time zones, and do you count that time zone yet, and when does it change? And so we got a question coming from the CFO, actually, that it was confused. These things were constantly changing, right? And so one option is, let me try to explain this really, not super complex, but more complicated versioning and logic and why this happened. What should I, all these other pieces, like, should I try to explain it? Should we get rid of it? Should we just turn it off? And what we ended up doing, which is really simple, is just showing the time zones on the bottom. And sometimes the visual is enough, right? Like, I can clearly see here, oh, I get it. It's counting these time zones through this hour and that and not. It didn't require some big explanation. It didn't require, a fight about whether we should be doing it or shouldn't be doing it, or do we have to go ask the POS team to hold transit, whatever it is. It was just about showing my work a little bit, just enough that it creates an understanding. And sometimes opening that black box just enough to show someone is going to be enough without having to do those pieces. I think the other thing with transparency is being aware of false edicts, right? So a lot of times in this relationship will be, whether it's data or tech or business, like you'll say, this is the way it is, right? Black or white. Everything has to be in Hadoop, or else you're going to get your wrist slapped, or we're going to yell at your boss. But the problem is when those edicts are either false or they're absolute, it gets really hard. So how do you start explaining, why does this make sense? What are the benefits we have from having all the data in Hadoop versus in DB2 or an Oracle database or operational sources? Showing those real benefits early and often, right? Whether it's, hey, we were able to fix this problem, we were able to help a customer, we were able to deal with an error or something in our system in a quicker way because we were doing this. And thinking about the consequences, both of the good, but also the consequences, right? So I'm saying everything has to be in Hadoop. Is that going to impact the speed of my checkout online? Or, so like having some of that back and forth of what it is. And I think it just comes down to, if you are inflexible, if you just sort of put these edicts from on top from a technology perspective, then you have that empathy breaking down and you can't be there. So you have to be transparent about what's there and open to those pieces. Other things, I talked about this before, is how do you have transparency to your backlogs, right? That's a big piece of it. And then the last piece I would say is, as a data practitioner, is I'm very passionate about how do we use data to manage our data and our tech, right? So how do I measure my data, my IT projects, using the data from them? How do I get away from managing on myths, and I feel like on anecdotes and on stories? How do I create tests? And it might not always be the perfect word. There's not always the perfect metric or something, but even if you can create some data, give some context to the conversation, it takes it away from this, I heard once, or we can never have real-time data because of A, B, and C, and you move it to, well, let's measure how frequently we have data updates coming in, or let's measure the stress on the server when we change this requirement or whatever it is. And I think, again, and maybe I'm a data dork, right? I said it at the beginning. I think data sort of becomes a tool for empathy also, because you can measure some of what's going on, how many people are using something, how slow is this, how many queries are timing out, finding ways to do that, and accepting that the data might tell a different story than what you wanted or expected. And some of it goes back to that idea of admitting when someone was wrong, right? If you can use data and the data comes back and says, you know what? The server can't support this change or can't support real-time data the way you wanted, you have to accept that data and then find another solution or look at different ways. So one of the lenses that I like to think about from a data perspective is how to use data in your personal life, right? We had some examples, the daycare, et cetera. So I wanted to share a few examples of how I use data in my life and how it can sort of tell you something, and then we could talk a little bit about it together. So my Fitbit, right, tracks my sleep. There's a couple things. So this is a couple years ago already, but something's funny here, right? And I also just like when, again, data can tell the truth and can sort of reflect on your life. So what happened? I went to Mexico with my wife, right? And so that's really, but like the data helps me inform my life and understand my life. The other one, using the same data source, is there's sort of this weird upward trend here, and especially the last few months, and I actually checked this morning, I've been getting some better sleep lately, so I'm closer to 7 hours than that. And you can see I wasn't very good at getting enough sleep. I probably still don't get enough sleep, but starting a new job, I'm a little less stressed. Not to blame Target, I love Target, right? But another one, but I think it's just a good reminder of like data infuses our whole lives and is an important part of how we do it, whether it's your personal life or how you use data to bring that to life. So I've been talking for a long time now, thinking about that empathy, the intellectual humility, the transparency. Let's take a minute and think about like how to use data to either measure your work or measure your life, and we'll share some examples after a minute. Hey, anyone have an example of how you use data at work, at life, at home? How does data make your life better, your work better?
So for us, it's
Go ahead.
GitHub commits.
GitHub?
The stories completed in Jira.
Yeah.
Incidents resolved, resolution. So there's some of the things.
Yep. Hopefully Microsoft doesn't worry doing GitHub. Right?
I get an insights email that says I worked 44 hours or something. I don't know where that data is coming from, and it's never really correct. I had 2 hours of meetings, but it's like I don't really know where that's coming from.
It's magical. Reading your mind. Other people, what data do you get about your work? What data do you get about your life?
Splitwise, it helps in managing your finances.
Okay.
Google Calendar, it keeps track of my day-to-day activities.
Yep.
The new feature in Apple, which says weekly what's the consumption of the gadget, be it iPad or be it the phone.
Yeah.
And the Jira board. Yeah.
The which one?
The Jira board.
Yeah. Jira board, yeah. Yeah.
I'm getting solar on my roof, and apparently this is going to include an app that tells me precisely how much energy we're using and generating, like all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
With the Nest thermostat, getting like a monthly report of like how much, the average energy each day and the temperature and how it compared to like the neighborhood or something.
Yeah. That's awesome.
In video games, my kill to death ratio tells me how good I am in respect to
Is it less than one?
always.
Focus.
This might not be exciting at video games, but at work, we in an agile team, we use Rally to keep track of our user stories, and we can see metrics on that, like how much velocity we have, how much is what we estimated for the user story to take, and how much is still to be done, and the actual amount of time. So you can look at charts to show you about all the user stories, what's the percentage of them that's done, and what still needs to be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, speaking more abstractly, pretty much this extends to anything that you can quantify and then plot against time.
Yeah.
My progress, my master's degree, where I am in my career.
Yeah.
This is all that people use implicitly, not necessarily electronically.
Yeah, maybe mental graphing, right? I think go ahead.
That's a funny one because there's a website where you can type in your birth date and it'll take your life expectancy and put little blocks. It's your progress bar. Like, that's a good motivation.
Kids, family. Go ahead.
using actual metrics like Grafana and that in production systems to actually show you the state of everything instead of relying on users reporting when something isn't working.
Or it's an anecdote, like one person experienced this one thing. I know at Target with like the website, sometimes within the Target firewall, it operates differently than out in the wild, and so like that could be frustrating.
Seeing a Steam calculator online, seeing how much I've spent on games versus how much I've played them. How much hours, dollars per hour it costs me.
So I've been traveling a lot more lately with this new job, but somehow getting more sleep. Maybe that's the secret. I'm getting away from my kids and I get more sleep, but I won't tell my wife. But in a lot of airports now, I'm always fascinated. They have like the little, in the bathrooms, they have like a little monitor, right? You can say like either smiley face or sad face, or like, 1 to 8, what do you think this is? So that's always, it fascinates me when we find new places to insert data feedback loops. Right? I never would have thought about an airport restroom that way. And the question is, do they do anything about it, right? It's like feedback without anything doesn't matter. Another interesting one we did, I had a colleague at Target who did some work on is, and it's sort of in that category of like thinking differently about data that's there every day, but actually can tell you different things. They did a lot of analysis of sort of the Exchange database, right? So emails going back and forth, meetings going back and forth, and you could actually start doing some really cool clustering and different sort of relational trees. And then you start, as a manager, you could go and say, hey, did you realize there's actually these 2 clicks in your team? And it might not ever really fully show itself except for via emails or who's in what meeting or who's getting excluded. But so there's always interesting ways to start thinking about the data differently and then using it to actually drive what you do in your life. Any last examples about data? We can keep talking about it. I could do this forever. So again, just sort of bringing home that last topic around the data, I think if we're trying to figure out this tension, figure out what it is, I would think about empathy, think about intellectual humility, think about transparency in everything that you do as an engineer, as an analyst, and I think that will help. So fourth, final topic, I think doing pretty good at time. We'll see if we go a little bit short. It could get a nice, I think it's still nice outside Saturday afternoon. The last piece, I think, and I sort of put this last, which is funny, is how do I create exciting, relevant, useful content, and useful data and visualization in those pieces. And so it's sort of funny because again, I'm in a business where we're creating a tool that helps you do some of this, but I actually don't know if this is relevant until you've worked through the emotions and these other pieces to really change your culture, and then you bring these pieces in. And so here's a guy, maybe in a meeting. He looks very engaged. Hopefully I don't see anyone here that's quite this bad right now. That'll be a bad sign. But so Edward Tufte, who's a data visualization expert, he's written all these books, and there's some really cool, he'll show the Civil War as a visualization over time and stuff. So he's famous for saying, if the statistics are boring, then you've got the wrong numbers. And so it is important how you take that data and make it useful and bring it together. And so one lesson, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I've seen in my time at Target and now at Domo. You have to give people something new and exciting, right? If I just try to take the baseline or take what they have now, whether it's in an old tool or what's there, you're not going to really sort of change the way that people are engaging with that content, right? So sometimes that might mean giving them more detail, giving to them in more real time, giving to them the way that creates an excitement about data. And one of my favorite stories at Target, where we started doing some of this and giving more real-time data, is we had opened a store in Manhattan. So Target's doing a lot of small format stores, I think maybe in Soho or someplace down there in the Village. And there were a bunch of executives who were out to dinner, and they were looking on their phone. Some of them actually could look at on their phone and see what was selling in the store, right? What were the sales, which categories, all those kinds of things. But only half of the execs, right? It was the head of investor relations, the COO, head of flexible formats, had that content, that card. And so they started emailing me saying hey, can I get this card? Can I do this? And that's not necessarily, the biggest business value, but if you think about changing culture, right? The fact that people are out to dinner and talking about data and looking at data and using the data, And then this also goes to the flip side that I was saying about the people creating the content, right? Whether you're an engineer or an analyst, it is, it's not fun to deliver things that people don't love, right? There's a concept of minimal lovable product rather than just minimal viable product. And so there is an excitement. If you are creating new, exciting, different content, that makes a difference in terms of how you can actually do it. I think the other thing is connecting strategy and focus and like what leadership is saying back to data, right? And so we saw this in a few ways. One of the first times I used Domo at Target, but even just in general, we had McKinsey come in, which is very cheap. No, it's not. And they had done this work on these sort of 12 key metrics for measuring the transformation of Target. And they were going to build some stuff for us and all these things. And we decided, okay, we're going to take those metrics and we're going to try to make them more real time. We're going to make them mobile. We're going to make them available. And actually, I still remember the first meeting with this SVP. I had never met her. And I think she expected that we were just going to deliver a plan for these metrics. And I actually showed her on my phone, like, here's the metrics, all these things. She actually gave me a hug, right? And so that excitement, that connecting it to the real life strategy, or to making it sort of flexible and connected to that. So like my team would prepare for merchandising offsites and strategic offsites. And when you have content that can react and can be part of a meeting and can sort of set the meeting, but then also let you dig in while you're doing it, it sort of starts helping you frame the strategy relative to the data rather than just feeling like the data is a request or it's an outcome. We've set the strategy and we're going to go ask for the data. How do you bring the data into the strategy conversations, make it real, make it live, and then you sort of bring it back there. Another thing I think is, and this is coming from some of this idea of end to almost end and some of the emotional baggage, is making the flexibility of your data real, right? So if you think back to the email we started with Amy, right? It's like she needed to be helped sort of through the stages of like she no longer has to justify all this, and maybe she was a little farther along because she actually sent the email. But one of the things we did at Target, which I really liked, was the idea of sort of really making it real for people and showing them how things have changed, right? So we had developed this dashboard for buyers. We brought in 15 buyers in the morning from like an hour and a half, from like 8 to 9:30. And we had people sitting and like listening to them. And you can do this for, it's not just data, it's any kind of product. At the end of the hour and a half, we said, okay, got it. Here's the 25 things we heard from you that you don't like or you want changed. Sent them away, brought them back the same day at 4 o'clock. Showed them, hey, here's the 13 of the 25 we've already changed. Here's how it looks. And we had some executives in the room. And I think it was just, I saw these light bulbs going off, right? And again, you have to sort of bring them through this process to understand that there's a different kind of way we want to be working with them, that it doesn't matter. I could have done 1 million decks, I could have done 1 million emails, and they never were going to experience it in the same way that they did when we actually made it real for them and showed them that difference. Because part of, if you think about this world of end to almost end, there's more curiosity and breaking down these barriers. If we just stay in our same silos and we don't ask questions, then it's sort of all for naught, right? If you're just going to grumble and not ask a question, the whole idea of flexibility, whether I'm building a product or a platform or data or insights, it's a conversation. And I can respond to the changing conversation. And if I don't teach people how to do that, then I'm in trouble. Be there when it counts, right? So this is my first Thanksgiving. I'm actually going to spend a significant amount of time with my family. But that's the reality of Target, right? Of being at a retailer over Thanksgiving, is being there to help people understand what's the data coming through and having, those different things. And so if it's not real at the times when it's counts, if it's not real where you can respond to what's changing and what we're trying to do, then you're never going to have that relevancy that's there. Last thing in terms of like thinking about the relevancy of content, that was sort of an interesting learning for me that I never expected as we were going on this journey around data at Target, is this idea of how does data frame your job? And so what started happening as like we infuse more data into people's lives at Target we started seeing, like any big company, you see some executives start moving around. So you have a vice president who moves from real estate and goes into merchandising, or vice versa. And people sort of started, when they started this new job, the first thing they were asking for was, where's my data in Domo? Where's my cards? Where's my information? And so it really sort of just, back to this idea of like the data can frame your entire experience as an organization. And then it frames, how do I do something like start a new job? It's no longer, I think, about, okay, well, in a few months, I'll get used to the reports I get once a month. I will actually let this be part of my job and sort of be part of how I move things around. So, last exercise I want to sort of do together is to think about, I shared some ideas about how I think we made data relevant and content relevant at Target. But think about in your life. It could be your job, it could be personal too. So sort of two different matrices here, two different axes. So one is, how relevant or useful is the data? And then how often do you actually use that data, right? So, and not necessarily good or bad, but would love to just spend a few minutes, think about the different data or how you interact with data in your life or at work, and then how does it fall in these quadrants, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Then would have an example of data they use very frequently. Yeah?
Student, I work in the university, so
Yep.
we use a lot of student information like trends and attrition rates, and if people are like dropping out in the first year, and how is it? That's where we use.
And how frequently do you, every day?
Every day.
Yeah. And so then, is it useful?
Yes, because every department, they see the trend, they see where the students are, what's the count and what's the trend, do they have to increase the number of seats every year?
Yeah.
So it's very useful.
Yeah. Then we have an example of data they look at a lot, but they don't find quite as useful.
Use certain data like that off our website because it's easy to get, but it's honestly not relevant and meaningful, but easy data is the one that people throw on it.
So it's the barrier is low, so I can just look at that, it makes me feel good, but it's actually not in reality that useful, at least not yet. Other examples of data you use frequently? What?
Patient disease.
Patient disease?
It's useful, but then when you go start a clinical trial, it could change easily.
Yeah, so it's not consistent, or
Yep.
it's not stable, which is part of the power of it. I think there is something down here too of how are you responsible with the data? So we started giving executives a lot more real-time data, right? So every 5 minutes from the spam, loading in sales, and so on those different pieces. And so I think there's a certain responsibility that comes with that. So I give Brian Cornell, who's the CEO of Target, a lot of credit because he's looking at this data, and I could see he's looking at it 5 times a day or 6 times a day. He could very easily have misused that data, right? He could have caused a whole bunch of fires and yelling at people, and, well, Brian says do this. And so there's a certain responsibility to frequency and to how you're doing that. I think the flip side is that same data can also become very relevant for very specific use cases, right? So if that same data is at the item level, if I'm the buyer for flowers at Target and it's Valentine's Day, I actually have actions I can take. But it's sort of knowing, is it worth that action or not? And I think one of the things with frequencies, I think there is value in frequent interaction with that, even if it's not the most valuable, because it's changing the cadence of the conversation. It's just making sure you don't fool yourself that it's valuable if it's just sort of there to change sort of the frequency. Anyone have examples of data that is actually very useful, but they don't use it a lot?
How much of certain types of data the customer loads into their system?
Yeah.
It's really hard to get that. We don't have any. It's not hard. We just don't have the metric or the tools. And so it would be useful, but we can't get it.
Yeah. So there's sort of a technical barrier to that is keeping you from doing that. But it would be really useful, but you're just not getting it as frequently as you need. Anyone else data that sort of on that top left? Yeah.
We always do cross sections of our products, but
yeah.
that destroys the product. So we can't do it all the time, and it takes a lot of time to do, but it's the most informative thing about product performance.
There's a cost to it, but the benefit is valuable, but so you can't necessarily push it all the time, but when you do it, high value. All right. Anything else on the grid or questions or stories to share? All right. So last thing I wanted to just share a few concepts that are helpful, again, if we're thinking about this content and what we're doing and how do we visualize the data. A lot of this comes from a colleague of mine at Domo named Brent Dykes and some of the different pieces. So one of the frameworks he talks about, if we're thinking about how do we use data to tell a story, is how do we think about the interaction between the data itself, but then there's a narrative around that data, right? So what are we actually saying about it? And then there's the visuals that maybe support that narrative. And so a lot of times we might end up sort of maybe squishing that all together and not thinking about those different components as we think about that. And so, right, if we just, and giving it back to like, okay, well, just give me the data or just give it to me in Excel, the data itself might not really be telling the narrative, or my visuals might not actually be supporting that. So some of the tips that can help us with better visual storytelling, identifying the right data, right? So like go back to like, is it useful? Is it available? Choose the right visualization, right? So whether you use a bar chart or you use a heat map or you use Neo4j or something more complex, can have a lot of power in terms of what you're actually doing, calibrating the visuals to the message you're trying to send, right? Whether it's what you're typing, whether you're saying in a presentation, what the conversation is in a meeting can be really powerful. Be wary of unnecessary noise. So, if you have other things that are interesting but not useful, or interesting but not relevant to the message you're trying to send, how do you get rid of those out of the conversation? And then focusing your attention on what's important. And I think when you do this well, it can also help focus things. It can also change a lot of how you even have conversations about data at an organization. So like last holiday, and again, this is my first year not doing this at Target, there was daily stand-ups of the chief merchandising officer and his team. And we sort of started new emails that went out, an hour or 2 hours before the meeting. And then everyone sort of has the visuals and like the understanding of what happened. So then the meeting is about what do we have to do. The meeting's not about everyone talking about what happened or having their turn to talk around a table. And that's also a case where even the idea of a stand-up or of a 15-minute meeting or a meeting with casual dress like Dilbert said, it's not really possible if you spend the whole time talking about the data or arguing about the data or all those other things. So thinking about how do you use that data to frame a conversation or even prep people for a conversation so you don't have to have this long meeting just to argue about the data, and then you have another follow-up meeting to align on the data, and then you have another follow-up meeting to actually get to what the action is, can be very frustrating. The last concept that I'll just share from Brent's work is this idea of knowing the difference between story framing and storytelling, right? And so a lot of dashboards, probably appropriately, are more on the story framing side, right? Where it's, I have key metrics, I'm going to, see how they're doing, what happened, but that's different than really telling a story about why, right? And digging into that. So it might also be, this starts the journey, but then storytelling is really the insight that can lead to action. And how do we think about those things differently? And I think it's easy to sort of like then poo-poo the basics of story framing, right? It's important, like I said, for like the meeting stuff, it's important to know what your metrics are, know how performance is doing, know if your tickets are up or whatever it is, but let's not confuse that from really digging in and saying, okay, now we're going to drill into why are tickets up. That might tell more of the story and actually lead to action. And so this is just sort of laying out some of the differences in terms of the purpose of story framing is more exploratory versus explanatory, thinking more broader of our focus versus storytelling. You're really going to go into like, how do I explain this? How do we get to action? How do I do what's going on? Might be more hierarchical when you're doing story framing versus linear on storytelling. Your preparation might be more automated, right? So that's where a lot of this idea of story framing is very attractive because you can automate it, right? You can say, here are my metrics, here's what's going on. The storytelling and really getting to insight might require some more specific curation of how we're doing it. Again, a story framing might be more dynamic. Really telling a story with your data might be more static, which is funny because, like, again, real-time data, AI, all these things. But part of the power of telling a story with data is taking a snapshot, drilling in, understanding what's going on, taking action on it, and knowing what happens. And so in some ways, that story is actually a static snapshot of what's going on, whereas your dashboard or your story framing is the constant living data that's telling you when you need to go dig in and go deeper. You know, in a story framing, you might just be drilling. When you're telling a story, it's more about how do I annotate, how do I highlight, how do I call attention to things. And then on the usage, like story framing might be multi-use versus storytelling is really single use. So any questions about these concepts? Just as a little hierarchy to sort of think about how do we visualize things and make meaningful content? Okay. So we might come in just under 3 hours, but still not bad. So again, just to sort of bring it all home, back to this fun diagram of all the data that's out there. Every day, tons of data about my sleep, about your driving, about whatever it is. And so end of the day, I think as practitioners of technology, whether we're engineers or budding software engineers or analysts or wherever we are in our careers, there's a lot of data out there, right? And we know it's there. I think anyone who would say otherwise is like, everyone knows you're supposed to talk about data. It's the new thing. Data is the new oil, whatever analogy you want to use. But ultimately, we need to make it our friend, and we need to make it useful. And so hopefully, going through these pieces that I feel sort of share a little bit of my experience of how do you unlock this for the 99%? How do you really make this real? Around how do we unlock and enable data curiosity, taking some of these ideas of end to almost end and empowering your teams in different ways. How do we adopt agile practices even in a data field that might not seem as agile on the focus and thinking about that little card, small teams, transparency, learning quickly. How do we use empathy, intellectual humility, and transparency to build more partnerships across our teams and break down some of these walls so that we can sort of move forward together and really unlock the power of data. And then lastly, how do we create exciting, relevant, and useful content to bring that all? So that is the end of my formal content. I'm happy to hear more feedback or answer questions or do it on the side as well. I have cards as well if people have any desire to follow up or anything like that. But questions? Yeah.
So you talked about practicing empathy, intellectual humility, and transparency with the people who you're basically building data analysis tools with. I'm wondering how you think about extending those same practices to the people who the data is about.
Good question. I mean, right, and so I think, and there's obviously a whole series of around privacy and around other pieces that you have to be cognizant about, right, and sort of how do you do it in an ethical way and how do you do it in a way that is not disrespectful of those people. You know, I think, to me, like, it's really hard to isolate any piece of it, right? Because if you think if you're practicing these things with the data the people you're sharing the data with, it sort of rings hollow to me if you're then turning around and not being honest and transparent backwards, right, with that. So for me personally, I think you have to do both. I don't think you can do one without the other, but I think it's a good reminder because it can get tricky because you can say, oh, well, I'm being transparent with these people, but I'm actually being unethical or intransparent with how I'm collecting the data. And certainly on that wheel of data, there's a lot of data out there that may or may not be public or you may or may not think is public. And certainly with Cambridge Analytica and all those things, you need to be careful about both sides. So it's a good question. For me, I don't think you can be true on both sides if you're not practicing it both ways, but certainly there's been plenty of examples where people forget about the upstream side of that. Okay, thank you everyone. I'll stay around for a little bit if people have questions and I'll put out my cards if people want. So thanks.